Good morning. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am the host and founder of Nonprofit Utopia. We're the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who have been following us, we have been focusing on social enterprise for the month of February. And this is our last day. For the past couple of weeks, we have been looking at things like, how do you develop your concept for a business? How do you research it? How do you develop a business model? How do you know if it's feasible and all that good stuff? We even talked to people who are in the business, so to speak. We learned how to pitch. We learned how to explore different legal structures. Today, we're going to look at folks and talk to them about what they see in the impact investment world. We're going to be looking at bankers or talking to bankers. I'm sorry, I'm looking at them now, but we're going to be looking at bankers, talking to bankers and impact investors, as well as, a high ranking official at Chicago Community Trust, and, just get their perspectives on what it takes to actually secure funds for social impact. All right, so today we have Daniel Ash. Daniel is the Associate Vice President for Community Impact at the Chicago Community Trust. We also have Ronald Milsap. He is the Vice President of Mission Deposits, and he's also the CRA officer at Providence Bank. And God willing, we will be joined by Allison Clark later on. All right. So without further ado, I am going to ask them to come to us in their own way, introduce themselves, and tell us a little bit about how they got into impact investing. And when we're talking about impact investing, from my perspective, I'm not just looking at it as, we're talking to venture capitalists, right? We're being very lenient with that term today. All right, so we are joined by, well, we were joined by Allison Clark. She'll be back, I'm sure. All right, so we're going to go in alphabetical order. Dan, we're going to start with you.
Thank you, Valerie. So my understanding is that how I got involved. The question is how we each individually got involved in sort of social impact investing.
Mm-hmm,
Um, for me, it's sort of twofold. One, a few years ago, the Chicago Community Trust, in partnership with MacArthur and other stakeholders, launched an initiative called Benefit Chicago. The idea was simple: was to sell investment notes in order to raise capital to support social enterprises in the Chicago region.
mm-hmm,
So I had the opportunity to sit at the table and watch that initiative develop and unfold. And also, I want to note that I sit on the board of a nonprofit in Chicago called North Lawndale Employment Network. And
mm-hmm,
we, a number of years ago, sort of launched a social enterprise called Sweet Beginnings, basically a business that sells honey-based products.
mm-hmm.
And again, with where the revenues would support sort of our core mission for the North Lawndale Employment Network. And I sort of I sit on the committee for that initiative. So those are my two sort of entry points to primary entry points to this space. And I will note too that I'm part and privy to many conversations at the trust um, where donors are expressing greater interest and thinking about how they use their philanthropic dollars to um, sort of provide capital to social enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's how I sort of come to this space.
Okay, awesome. All right. Allison Clark, I know that you were not on initially. What we're doing is we're asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us how you came to this impact investing space.
Sure. So thank you, everybody. And I'm sorry it took me a little while to be able to get in. I was having some technical issues. So I've been involved in my work is I'm the Associate Director of Impact Investments at MacArthur Foundation. So I've been involved in impact investing on behalf of the foundation for 15 years. Before that, my background was in other types of investing, both commercial real estate investment through banks, and then also working at Fannie Mae. So I've been involved in this space for a very long time. Our primary tool at MacArthur Foundation is the use of a program-related investment, which is where we can actually make a loan directly to a nonprofit organization, or just as Daniel was describing, we actually helped support, along with the trust, the creation of the Benefit Chicago platform, where we invested $50 million of capital into that fund. So we've have a long history of investing both directly into organizations as well as investing into fund structures, like Daniel mentioned, and also investing through other enterprises like community development, financial institutions, and things like that.
Okay,
So
awesome.
I hope that's helpful.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you so much. And Ronald.
I'm gonna pick up exactly where Allison just left off about my entry into impact investing. It may not be the same way that we typically think about impact investing, but my way was working for a CDFI. So working for community development financial institutions, I would say from a retail level, give retail clients opportunity to essentially vote with their wallet and their purse to put their money in community banks, and other community development vehicles that are making impact, job creation, providing key resources in food deserts or what have you. And I also participate on a couple of local boards with My Block, My Hood, My City, and EG Wood, that are using their mission and their impact to make social good. So that's kind of where I would say better part of 8 to 10 years now, exposed to this sector and working with clients and serving on boards to do well by doing good, essentially.
Okay. So I guess we want to get some things out of the way in terms of, I guess, just pure definition. Okay. And I know this sounds basic, but not everybody, is on the same, I guess, same path in terms of knowledge of financial terms and whatnot. Anyone who wants to step up and answer this question, what is the difference between a loan and equity investment?
I guess as a banker,
Okay.
a loan is debt, and requires some repayment of principal and interest, or so you really start making payments on debt. Sometimes you can have some of it deferred, depending on how things are structured, but for the most part, it's a debt, it's an obligation, you have to repay it. Equity is that it could, it too, an investment standpoint, you ultimately want to see a return, but it can also, that principle can also be lost if the business doesn't necessarily do well. Typically, when you're starting a business, whether raising through friends and family or through venture capital to methods, you're trying to get equity to go out and get the business up and form and profits before you have to start incurring any repayment, so to speak, out the gate. I'm sure the others could add more to that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear different perspectives. And Dan, I'm pretty interested in understanding, more about impact investing, from your perspective. I realize that that's not necessarily your role, so to speak, but there are donor advised funds at Chicago Community Trust. And I just want to get a sense for what role those funds may play in terms of investing in the social sector.
Sure. So let me, in the spirit of defining, so a donor advised fund is a charitable donation to the Chicago Community Trust, and so a donor will make a contribution to a fund, just like they make a contribution to any other 501c3. A donor advised fund is just that. It's a fund that the dollars are directed by that donor to, in most cases, other nonprofit entities. However, I would say this: a donor can use those funds to, and I'll use Benefit Chicago as an example, to invest in a social enterprise like Benefit Chicago. The key characteristic, though, is that any gains from that um, that investment goes back into the donor advised fund, not to the donor themselves, right? So, and Allison and Ron are the experts at this. I'm not a banker. I'm not a finance expert. But as I said at the top of this session, donors are increasingly looking for innovative, creative ways in which to have social impact. So in addition to making grants, they want to use their philanthropic capital, if you will, to sort of launch and trigger sort of other impacts at the community level. But a key point that I don't want to get lost is that once money goes into a donor advised fund, it can never sort of go back and benefit personally the donor themselves or the family. And sometimes people get a bit confused about that point.
All right, awesome. And then for you, Allison, what is a PRI and how is that different from either a loan or, I guess, traditional equity investing?
Right. So I think it's really important just to reiterate the difference between debt and equity, and then also understand what we're talking about in terms of nonprofits, because nonprofits technically don't have equity. They have net assets. So it's a little bit of a different thing. We sometimes use those interchangeably, but it is an important distinction, because when you invest equity in a business, the goal is that ultimately that equity will increase in value to the benefit of the owner. And that can be either, it can come in the form of selling the company or taking the company public or something. And that's when that equity returns value to the owner of the company. Nonprofits obviously don't have that. So when you make a grant to a nonprofit organization, that money could become part of their net assets if they choose not to spend it right away. But it's a very different type of thing than if you buy equity in a company. So, but that distinction is important, because what a PRI is, and that's a program related investment. This is a tool that philanthropy has to be able to help support nonprofits and other charitable activities by making a loan or other type of investment. So it's not a grant. So we make this with the intention of the capital, the amount of money invested being returned to the foundation. But we, as a foundation, can only do that if we do it on terms that no profit-seeking individual or institution would make. So that typically means that this is a loan that's unsecured. So means we don't have collateral. We don't put a mortgage on a piece of property or anything like that. There's not a personal guarantee or any other type of lien that we take. And we typically only charge 1% to 2%. Our typical borrower would be, in the case of a lot of the work that I've worked on, has been affordable housing developers, also CDFIs, like was just mentioned. So these are organizations that aggregate capital and then make loans to small businesses and homeowners and things like that. So we've made lots of loans to CDFIs. And then we have done some lending through the Benefit Chicago platform directly into social enterprises. So that's our primary tool is a loan. So a PRI can be a loan. Just to be clear, it can be a loan. It just looks a little bit from the loan than the type of loans that might be made by other types of investors. A PRI can be equity. That we don't do that as frequently, but we certainly have done that. We do equity either into equity funds, or sometimes we've done it directly into a venture itself. Although that's less common for a variety of reasons. There's other way PRIs can work though too. We've also used guarantees. So sometimes there's enough capital that's coming to a fund or to an enterprise, and what they really need is they need a guarantee that brings the other investor to the table. So we've done that as well.
Okay, awesome. And Dan, I know you've got to leave early, and typically I leave the case studies for the end, but this time we're going to put at least one of the case studies first. I wanted to hear about the Tribune case, where Chicago Community Trust has actually been a part of the team that funded the takeover, for lack of a better word. And that really was not what it was. The acquisition of the Tribune, and it's now owned by a nonprofit entity. So if you can share how you guys came to get involved with that deal.
Well, sure. First of all, a couple of clarification points. The Chicago Community Trust is a donor to Chicago Public Media, which recently, um, quote unquote, acquired the Chicago Sun-Times. And I could sort of speak to two things. So this is a case where a business, a for-profit business, um, was was acquired by a nonprofit. A couple of sort of details that I want to make clear. Um, the Chicago Sun-Times, in being acquired by Chicago Public Media, was converted into a nonprofit. So as a funder, we made a decision to support sort of this acquisition for two primary reasons. One, we see local journalism period, as a public good that needs to be supported. And we thought it was important that the local community continue to have a number of major sort of media platforms covering news of the region. But again, this was a traditional grant made to Chicago Public Media to support, this acquisition and support content that would sort of come from it. One thing that would be, I think a lot of folks from outside looking in, made some assumptions that, okay, this is a nonprofit that's going to acquire a business and it's going to remain a LLC. And in this case, that is not true. But rather, there was a decision to convert the business to a nonprofit. Um, and so Valerie, let me stop there and let you ask maybe some probing questions so I can make sure I'm providing information that's beneficial to you and the
Mhm.
audience.
Okay, yeah. So what was it that made that deal attractive to you guys?
Well, as a deal, again, I think the key point is for us, it was about mission, right? Like, in order to um, function well as a civil society at the local level, you need a healthy and national level. You need a sort of
Yeah.
healthy media sort of ecosystem that's reflecting sort of the needs of the local community, and providing, quite frankly, a place for
Mhm.
public discourse, and sparking public discourse. So I need to make clear that sort of from our perspective, it was all about mission.
Mhm.
And I will make this point, given that I'm here. We have a hairy, audacious North Star goal to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And our argument, and my argument to our board, has been that any societal goal like that, or social goal like that, requires a good, well-functioning, diverse sort of media ecosystem. So
Mhm.
first and foremost, it was about mission. Um, Now, we didn't make, let me be clear, as a philanthropy, we didn't make dictate sort of terms to Chicago Public Media. They made the decision to accept the assets of the Chicago Sun-Times, convert that infrastructure to a nonprofit infrastructure, and then raise capital to sort of support that transition and over the next
Mhm.
few years. One thing that we did do with our grant, and again, I make this point that we made as a condition of our grant, that grant can't be spent to pay down existing debt for that the Chicago Sun-Times may have had. So we made that
Mhm.
decision that our grant has to be sort of forward-looking, if you will, and not cover the losses or debt
Mhm.
accumulated um, by the Sun-Times while I was an LLC. So that was an
Mhm.
important point. Other donors, individual donors may have made different choices. But again, we felt, as the steward of our grant making, we should restrict our dollars in a way that benefited the public moving forward. Another one point I will make is there are models in the world of journalism where nonprofit entities have taken ownership of a for-profit business So they become the primary shareholder, and that business still functions as a business, as a social enterprise that's aiming to not just break even but earn revenue. Um, Again, it was not our choice to make, but like that could have. There are models like that where newspapers become. Um, and Allison, you probably can help me with some of the language here, but they
Mhm.
move from being a sort of like a pure for-profit mechanism to being positioned as a social enterprise, and work hard to make themselves available to philanthropic investments. The example that I think is most prominent and most written about nationally is in Philadelphia, where the Philadelphia Inquirer is essentially owned by the Community Foundation in Philadelphia. Yeah, that's not the case here. The case is that the
Mhm.
Chicago Public Media owns it. Um, I will insert a point. I actually, and this is something I, a perspective that I carry. I do think businesses that were sort of purely just traditional businesses that are looking to either become nonprofit or some social enterprise, some variation of a social enterprise, and then look to philanthropy for support, either through grants or PRIs or other forms of capital. I do think there's sometimes a naive assumption made about the availability of that capital long
Mhm.
term, right? So one thing that I've been arguing, um, even in the Sun Times still, is that you have to build a sustainability plan just as you would have had to
Mhm.
do if you were a LLC, right?
Mhm.
This idea of perpetual grants year over year over year, um, being deployed, particularly being deployed to underwrite deficit spending, is
Mhm.
not something we like to do in philanthropy. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, we want our organizations, our institutions that we support to be solvent and financially healthy. So at times, as you think about impact investing, and particularly from that direction, you know, traditional business becoming some variation of a social enterprise, you know, we often have to say this is not okay. All of our worries are have dissipate because philanthropy or individual donors or even readers who are going to donate to the platform are going to be happy with, you know, spending that exceeds revenue. so
Right.
so one thing that I and again, I like this intersectional space where people who have been in traditional businesses are now engaging folks who have had careers in the nonprofit space and the space of philanthropy, because we're learning a lot about each other's culture, and how we expect, again, businesses to function. So again, right now, I know, speaking because I've spoken quite often with the Chicago Public Media folks, you know, they're very committed to building a business plan that's going to, you know, again, make the Sun Times solvent. And it can, and if
Mhm.
they don't, they, they will not be able to keep the business open, just as it
Mhm.
was, you know, struggling as a, again, for profit enterprise. I'll stop there and let
Mhm.
others weigh in.
Yeah, yeah, Allison, you look like you had several ideas. I could see the light bulb going on over here.
So I mean, and MacArthur was part of this transaction as well, and we're very excited to be part of it. But I do think that Daniel's really the point I want to lift up that he said, where he's absolutely spot on, is that just being a nonprofit owned organization doesn't mean that the organization doesn't actually still have to have a business model where they can actually be sustainable, and whether that means that they can earn revenue sufficient to be able to cover their costs, or whether they have a combination of additional, ongoing grant support and income. That's really important to figure out, and I think that that's just really an important thing to think about in terms of impact investing, period. There are things that work very well where they lend themselves to the use of impact capital because they earn rents, or they are lenders and they have interest that can come, or they have contracts that they can enter into that give them the ability to generate excess earnings over the cost of producing those services that they can use to retire the debt. It's just very important to remember that impact capital isn't the same thing as a grant, and it isn't really obligating it isn't relieving the obligation of the organization to have a business plan that actually points them towards long-term sustainability. So I just wanted to lift up that point, because I think sometimes when people think about impact capital, it doesn't always work for things like social service organizations. It can, but usually that's a case where it's bridging some sort of a gap in financing, and they just need that interim cash between when they do the work and when they receive a state or federal grant to get it done. But debt is not the perfect tool for all organizations in all cases, and so I just think that's a really important thing to think about as organizations try to contemplate how best to use impact capital to help them meet their own mission.
Okay, great. Ron, did you want to weigh in?
I think they really answered the question well. And then just sitting from the seat of a banker, most banking and traditional finance is still very much, cash flow and collateral and guarantor support in terms of the underwriting, which is conservative by nature. So when you think about a social enterprise or a nonprofit for that matter, you don't have sustainability, or you haven't like fully vetted kind of your how your theory of change and how your social enterprise work actually creates the ability to service that debt through proof, right? I think the best social enterprises actually they're solving a big enough problem where it draws enough attention and initial capital to support it. But the sustainability is really built on core business practices. If you don't have a strong operation, a strong product or service, or something that you're doing in the marketplace that you can exchange for value, then those social enterprises typically don't last very long. And that's the unfortunate part, that like government subsidy, grants, donor advised funds, they're not there for perpetuity.
It's interesting. I've heard more financial people talk about the theory of change this month than I ever have. When I was in business school, we didn't talk about the theory of change. What's more important, the theory of change or the value proposition, or are they of equal importance? Anybody?
So I'll jump in and say I think that the theory of change is what motivates an investor to make a decision about where to invest beyond just the financial capability of an organization or venture to pay it back. So any impact investor will always have more opportunities to deploy capital and more requests for that capital than they can necessarily meet. So the theory of change is what's going to govern. That's what lets us develop a strategy for how we use our capital and how we develop our programs. And that's what enables us to be able to get approval from our board to invest. But the financial proposition is important too. I never want to lend money to an organization that I don't think has a reasonable chance of paying me back, not because I want the money back, but because I ultimately want them to be able to go and get additional capital in far bigger numbers than I can provide from bankers and from insurance companies and from pension funds and all the other sources of impact capital that exist out there. So I will say, but clearly for me, as I look at our portfolio and as I work with our portfolio manager, we are always looking at financial performance and trying to project out whether or not we think an organization is on track to be able to repay us. But we equally are looking for that impact measurement too. And are they on track to meet their mission that they stated at the outset was their intention? So we have sort of two thoughts in our mind. One is, how are they performing financially? And then also, how are they performing against what their initial goals were? And they're equally important. I consider it almost a worse outcome if I've made a loan to an organization and they pay me back, but they don't accomplish any even marginally towards what they thought they were going to. That to me is such a wasted opportunity that is that's a big deal. And yeah. Anyway, I'm curious what the other folks would say.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with Allison 100%. Both are critical, and I want to just underscore the latter point. A value proposition, an organization be it a social enterprise, a nonprofit, um, any type of impact organization needs to really think about the value that they're going to bring to the marketplace and who's going to want to purchase that value. And I think, again, too often, um, folks who start nonprofits or start social enterprises somehow thinks that they may have some relief from that marketplace pressure, that competitive pressure. And I think that we need to sort of disavow people of that belief and 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 and, and make sure that they're, again, thinking about the impact that they want to have on the world, but also think about who's going to purchase my product, be it a service, be it a widget, be it a platform, and 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 hold those two things comfortably together as an organization. I will say this again, but one last point before I step away. This is where having really healthy dynamic boards are important so that you um, have access to leaders who sort of bring these sensibilities, bring these competencies to the table, so to help organizations think through these strategic questions. So again, as Allison said, both are equally important.
Okay, awesome, awesome. All right. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us. We realize that you're sacrificing much time.
Oh, I'm
All right.
glad to be here. I'm sorry for having to step away early, and I look forward to talking to you three in the future. Take care.
Okay.
Bye
All
bye.
right. You
Bye
too.
bye.
Bye-bye. And thanks. All righty. So now we've got a banker and an impact investor. This should be fun. I want to get a sense too for, nuances, I guess, in terms of the differences of what a banker might look for in an investment versus an impact investor. And, are there similarities and are there differences in the way you might view credit, so to speak? Um, does either one of you want to go first?
I definitely think that the differences, particularly when you thinking about early stage social enterprise, where it can be kind of hard to initially get access to capital. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Traditional banking still presents similar barriers, so it's important from the standpoint, like in your last question, like which are important, and they're both equally important. So to the extent that you have a proof of concept, have started your kind of working out and executing your theory of change, and you've been able to make meaningful impact, I think at the very least, I think there is a definite sector of banking where I think there's more appetite and perhaps even programming to be able to get access to capital. I think the CFI banks as well as community banks tend to have more offerings by way of helping businesses kind of initially kind of start out, and to the extent that they compare those things with federal funding or grant funding, definitely creates the opportunity to access capital. But banks are looking for the ability, very much like the impact investor. Can you sustain operations? Can you, in the case of a PRI, can you return the principal back? We don't want to make a loan that then to a situation where the bank ultimately can't be repaid. So I definitely think we're looking for your ability not just to sell an idea, um,
Mm-hmm.
actually have a proven track record. Um, Banks typically looking for 1 to 2 years of track record to be able to look over how the business has performed. And to that extent, you may be able to access. Allison talked about, and we do this a lot in the contractor space where we partner with Hire 360 and some other groups.
Mm-hmm.
Give minority contractors access to capital. They clearly have, for-profit business concerns, but they've been able to tap into relationships and philanthropy that can stand up, reserves and different forms of capital to support, losses, and banks could take risks that they otherwise wouldn't be comfortable taking. So I think you have to look for different programs and partnerships to help get that access, but a
Mm-hmm.
track record and a real proof of concept around what you're doing. Ultimately, it's going to be hard to get impact capital the same way it would be to get bank capital.
Okay, great. Allison, did you want to share?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we think about when we think about impact capital and what really differentiates it from other types of capital out there is that it's patient and flexible and long term. Because I think when you're dealing with any type of a big social issue, you need time. And as Ron mentioned, it's 1 to 2 years. That's about where banks are able to lend, and it's not just because they don't want to lend further, but that's just the way that the banking system is set up. It's the way that their regulators feel that that's the appropriate way for them to invest capital. And it's very difficult to do it longer term than that. But when you're dealing with really complicated social issues that need this type of flexible capital, the time to do that work it's much longer. They're complicated issues. That's why they haven't been solved to date. And so being able to think about how to provide capital longer term to be able to really give time for the needle to significantly move on the issue is very important. So I'll give an example. Our typical loan is 10 years. And that might be, for example, if we're making a loan to a nonprofit housing developer, that will let them maybe do 2 or 3 real estate developments because they can cycle that capital through a couple of deals. But if I give it to them for 1 to 2 years, they might do one deal, and that's fine. But certainly in terms of impact, giving them capital longer lets them do more. But when we were doing some work a number of years ago in trying to help nonprofit housing developers increase the energy efficiency of their properties, we wanted to give them capital to let them be able to do the types of property upgrades that would save on water costs or electrical costs or things like that. Those loans typically had to be made for 15 years because even though the owner might be making saving money, the savings just you have to spread that out over time for them to be able to harness those savings to pay you back. A 15-year loan is something that a bank really wouldn't typically be able to provide. So that's the kind of place where impact capital can step in and do something slightly different.
Okay, so Ron, what at a very minimum should new businesses have in place before they come to talk to you looking for funds?
I think sometimes people underestimate the impact of relationships.
Hmm.
And I would encourage any aspiring social entrepreneur, anybody that's currently in business, to really look to community banks and CDFIs to consider that there's a good starting point to begin a banking relationship.
Hmm.
Um, what dollars flow can help shift how markets react and respond to how our country is shifting around social impact.
Hmm.
To the extent that community banks and CDFIs tend to be more aligned with the mission of social enterprises and nonprofits, to get that additional capital into those places helps on the other outcomes in terms on the back end of those institutions being able to support you as you grow. Clearly, much to Allison's point, we'll maybe do a 5-year loan or a 7-year loan. And typically the capital isn't nearly as patient as it can be from impact investors. But you want many different sources of capital in your overall capital stack. And banks and their debt certainly play a role in helping you be able to scale your enterprise. So I would encourage folks to think about where are you doing some of your banking? Where are some of your key relationship centers? And get into those institutions that align with your values. We use a tool called Mighty Deposits, which is really good in being able to identify a bank's kind of core niche or focus area. You have banks that are focused on agricultural aspects. You have banks that are focused on affinity, whether that's directly invested into the African American or Latinx communities. You got the First Women's Bank right here in our state. Have these different sectors of banking and finance, some of which that have always been aligned to a social good and making a greater impact than you typically see in the large regional or national banks. But they all play a role, and they all have important roles that they play in terms of how capital moves in terms of business. So I would say think about, where are your relationships, how to build on them, and how to have conversations early in your development so that someone understands where you're trying to go, how you're trying to get there, and what your needs ultimately are. To come in when cash flow is already tight, can't really get the receivable or anything to kind of turn around. You're not showing much profit over the last couple of years. And then to raise kind of that red flag, it's going to be hard for a new partner to want to jump into that situation and try to, ultimately try to work you out of it. So you want to start, build strong relationships, and have folks kind of understand where you are on your continuum as you develop that business.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Same question for you, Allison. At a very minimum, what should social enterprises have in place before they come knocking on your door?
So just to be very clear, so we do not typically invest directly into social enterprises. So what we do is we provide capital to community development financial institutions on a bigger amount, and then they are able to make loans to social enterprises. We just aren't set up to be able to do the types of retail lending like Ron is at a bank. So we tend to work through those intermediaries. We have done a few instances, in certain situations where we've done them, and it's challenging, and there often needs to be more of a ongoing contact with the business that we just aren't sort of set up to do. So, but what I would say is that as organizations do go to CDFIs, and we're very, very lucky in Chicago that we have a great number of them that actually do meet businesses where they are, depending on the size and the sort of the age of the organization. Certainly having a couple of things in hand helps. I mean, all the things that Ron talked about, I think having a very clear vision about where it is and where you are now and where you want to get to. And from a staffing standpoint and a governance standpoint, what are the things that you think you are thinking about as you move forward in terms of your own organizational growth, and being willing to talk to your lender about that? That's going to be really important, because it will give beyond just the mechanics of the loan and how the capital is going to be used right away. Being able to talk about long-term where you think you're going is going to be very important.
Okay, great. So while I have you here, can you tell us a little bit about Benefit Chicago?
Sure. So Benefit Chicago is an initiative, and I know Daniel started to talk about this before. This was a lending platform that we launched with the Chicago Community Trust, and also with an organization called Calvert Foundation, which is based in Bethesda, Maryland. And this was a $100 million fund that was put together. It combined $50 million from MacArthur Foundation, and then $15 million from the Chicago Community Trust. And the source of their capital was from the donor-advised funds that Daniel mentioned. And then the other $35 million was raised through the sale of something called a Calvert note. And these were individual investors and institutional investors. The smallest increment of a note was $20, and the largest, I think, was $1 million. And that capital was all pooled together into this $100 million loan fund that was then used to make loans across a variety of different issue areas and different types of organizations here in Chicago. So that launched a number of years ago. We are close to being fully committed on that. I think there's about $94 million, I think, I'd have to go back and look today, of investments that have been made using the Benefit Chicago Capital platform. Some of it has been invested through intermediaries like Illinois Facilities Fund and Chicago Community Loan Fund and organizations like that. Some has been invested in real estate developers who are doing some very high impact projects across Chicago. And then some have been invested in social enterprises directly.
Okay, awesome. And how much longer do you expect the fund to be around?
Well, so the fund is going to be around for probably, I think it's about 10 more years. I can't remember if it's 9 or 10. I have to go back and look at, but we, as I say, we are almost close to being fully committed. And back to the point we were talking about before, with the idea of really needing to have patient long-term capital. Once the fund is committed, that money is going to be outstanding mostly through the end of the fund. So, and in some cases, like when it's invested in the CDFIs, it's going to continue to recycle. And so even though our investment is out the door once, that money will be revolving multiple times and touching lots of different organizations and projects over the next 10 years. But we are very close to being fully committed, which is exciting because we've been at this now for a long time. And so it's nice to know that there's $100 million out on the street, so to speak, doing good and important work here in Chicago.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All righty, last question for you both, and we'll start with Ron. Ron, what are some of the lessons you've learned over the years working with social enterprises?
I think to Allison's point, you have to be patient. And I've seen organizations start infinitesimally small, but then committed, dedicated, hard work, All that, you definitely have strong leadership at the top and somewhat of a visionary that can pull other people in. And once they catch fire, it's amazing to see how quickly they can grow and scale. So I've learned, don't write off a potential opportunity, particularly in banking, when you're moving transaction to transaction, not to think transactionally, but to think from like a whole relationship and ecosystem perspective. Particularly, you can, even at an early stage, offer someone some critical advice of things that they should look out for and learn from. I try to take every client relationship, whether we have success in terms of getting to their desired outcome at that time or not, is that sometimes a no is a not right now. It's not a permanent no. And then with all of their going through those experiences of taking applications and working through a bank's lending process, how are they being educated through that process? Because I feel like once you can show people the rules, the parameters, the standards, that most people can reach the bar. If they know what the bar is, they have it within themselves to figure out what they need to do to ultimately reach that bar. So I found that being a person first in banking is way more important. What's on my business card and the signature over the top of the building, because if we want to do well in a space of who we are in community and through relationship building, we have, number one, have to have some consistency to our person. Have to have that same kind of consistency and passion in their social enterprises and businesses that they're building within the community. It may not be successful to start out with. It may take years to develop and ultimately off the ground. And you're going to get a lot more no's than you're going to get yeses to start out with. But I've seen folks who are tireless and hardworking eventually break through and have tremendous success. So I've learned not to give up on people, not to give up on myself, not to give up on our communities, and that over time, we are all part of the solution if we choose to be. I'm fully committed, person in my being, to be a part of the solution, not only for the communities that are near and dear to my heart, but for this region and for this nation and for this world. So to that extent, I look forward to continuing to build beautiful relationships like I have with you, and certainly, and we're all part of the same kind of ecosystem. Let's just keep doing the work. And the outcomes, especially when I think about it from an African American perspective, you're not going to do 400 years of oppression 2 year long. And I'll say this is probably the last piece I'll say. I think like we have folks who are very much social change agents and activists that are doing the work, so to speak, on the streets. But for us that exist inside of institutions that may not always have policies and procedures that are equitable to the communities that we serve, that we have to be willing to fight that good fight internally as well. And it does take time to change some of those systems. But we have to fight that fight for them to make that pathway and that access to capital more achievable. Because when you have folks who are working on recidivism and other key issues that bring down violence in our communities, well, we fail as bankers if we don't find solutions to be able to wrap around those key nonprofits that are working in that sector to bring about that change. Imagine you got this nonprofit that's doing great work, but are solely dependent on federal funding to make some of this stuff happen. And they can't meet payroll week to week or month to month because they don't have a line of credit to do so. Banks have to find flexibility to be able to figure out how do we get this institution this capital so that they can have a bridge to other forms of capital that are coming in so they can be sustainable and successful. So sometimes we hold the keys to those social enterprises' sustainability, and we have to be able to turn those keys even when we get no internally, because we realize the impact on the street is so much more detrimental if we don't get that yes.
Indeed. Okay, Allison, last word.
So I don't know that I could say anything better than what Ron just said. I think he summed it up perfectly. Here's what I would say. Just a couple thoughts, and just back to the point though about starting social ventures. I think a couple things. One, Ron, you said something before which I thought was really powerful, which is thinking about sort of how do you identify the opportunity to create a business where you're meeting a need, and I think that's really important. And I think it's so as people are thinking about starting social social enterprises, which are a great way to affect change, and particularly for nonprofits that start social enterprise as a way of diversifying their income and being able to support themselves. That's all a really important, really creative way to try to think about long-term sustainability. But it's really important to try to make sure that whatever that venture is, A, that it's somehow aligned with what it is that you're doing, and B, that you know that you're meeting a need that somebody will then say, this is really great, I want to step up and support that. I sometimes see social enterprises that think that they're going to make a consumer product that may or may not have competition within the marketplace it's going to make it very hard for that particular organization to stand out. But the really good and successful social enterprises is where there is a need that's being met that isn't being met in the marketplace, and where you can also then bring forward opportunities for job creation or things that meet a need that otherwise isn't being met in the marketplace. But also, to Ron's point, please understand that in the case of a fast no is sometimes the best thing that you can do for an organization. But to Ron's point, don't assume that a no means no forever. But it does mean that there are an awful lot of times that an organization will come to me and I just know it's not something I can do, and I will try to say no up front rather than have the organization feel like if they can just do something slightly different that I would be able to fund it. And I think the other thing is to remember that foundations and banks and things have really invested very heavily in CDFIs to build up a capacity of organizations, this really key infrastructure of organizations within the Chicago marketplace and nationwide, that can provide technical assistance, that can provide connections to organizations, to other types of either grant makers or other investors or just other business opportunities. Really, it's important to leverage those relationships as much as possible, because they will always be able to do more intensive engagement with any type of a social enterprise than I can, and probably even Ron too, because that's really what they've been set up to do, is to do that level of engagement.
Okay, awesome. All righty, we have come to the end of our show. I don't see that we have any questions. If you're out there in the audience, please post now or forever hold your peace. Doesn't look like we have any questions, but I wanted to say thank you so much, Allison and Ron. And Dan had to leave early. You guys have been awesome. You really, gave us a good insider view as to what goes on in the minds of investors as you look at what we put forth before you as business owners and as nonprofits and other social enterprises. All righty.
Okay.
Thanks, Valerie.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, guys. All right,
Bye, everybody.
all right. Bye-bye.